I'm Dr. Sherry Gaither. Welcome to Empowering Your Life and welcome to a new series, God is in Control. And this is part one. God is in control. God has you where you are. That's part one. God has you where you are. And I hope that you will listen to this series. I say that every time, but this is an important series. It's a hard one because sometimes where God has us, we didn't volunteer, we didn't ask, and we're trying to figure out, God, what are you doing? So I need you to listen, and I need you to get involved and share this word with other people, because these are some difficult times we're living in. Yet God knows where you are, and He has you where you are. So over the last 2 weeks, we have all looked at television, whatever station, been on social media, and we have witnessed the devastation of Hurricane Helene, and the loss of lives, the loss of property, catastrophic conditions, and tragic circumstances. We've watched it, we've looked at it. We may have had family members and people we know who have been involved with all of that. And our hearts and our prayers go out to all of those who have struggled to recover, struggled to get a handle on where they are and what's going on. And you know, all of us know that this is not an overnight thing. This recovery is going to take years and years to regain, to recoup, to repossess, and to rebound. To gain, to recoup, to possess, and to rebound. It's going to take time. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing. And so really, that's what it really means to recover. You've got to regain. You've got to recoup. You've got to repossess, and you have got to rebound. And sometimes when the wind is knocked out of you and all you can see is what's in front of you, it is difficult to see God in the midst. Do I have a witness? All of us have had times in our lives where we could not see God, and we know and quote, all things work together for the good, and we know that, and we quote that, and that sounds good. But in reality, when you are looking at major catastrophe, major loss, catastrophic thing. That word catastrophic has been used more in the last year and a half, 2 years than I have ever heard it in my life. But as believers, it is important, it is so important that we know how to survive difficult times. As believers, it's so important that we know how to survive difficult times. And really, how do you stay anchored? You know, just think about it. How do you stay anchored in the Lord when the winds of adversities come? Staying anchored in the Lord when everything around you is blowing and tossed to and fro. How do you stay anchored in the Lord? When you're trying to figure out where is God and where is God in all of this, and does He care, and why did He allow? And those are questions that are very, very difficult. And those are questions that, if we were to be honest, we want to ask when things go left, or when things seem like they're going south, or whatever word you want to use. When you're struggling to keep your head above the waters financially, relationally, with your children, with your job, with your health, with any number of things, how do you handle it? How do you survive? And the story of Moses and the children of Israel in the 14th chapter of Exodus, it really helps us to know how to follow God's instructions even when we don't understand. The 14th chapter, we're going to look at that in just a moment, because it's not easy. It's not easy. And even though you know you've got God's presence, even though you've got God's provision, even though you know you've got God's promises, even though you know you've got God's power, it is not easy to follow God, to see what He's doing, to want to not lean into your own understanding, to not exit at the next, not to get off at the next exit. It's hard. So I've entitled part one, God has you where you are. God has you where you are. And at times, that really is the hardest thing to believe, that God has allowed us to go through certain circumstances, certain situations. But the Bible is full of examples. I mean, full of examples of individuals who had to weather the storm, who had to endure crisis, who had to withstand attacks, who had to live through the pain, because God had a purpose. Now let that settle. Let that settle in your mind, because God has a purpose. And everything God has is to bring him glory. Everything God does is to bring him glory. And at the time, we cannot see beyond the situation, but God has a purpose. And you know, there's a song, He Knows My Name. Well, he does. He knows your name. And by the way, that's easier to sing than it is to walk out. And he knows exactly where you are. And he has chosen you and allowed me to go through certain things. He knows where we are. So he knows our name. He's chosen us. We didn't volunteer. He knows why he's chosen us. It is always a reason for why, or a reason that will give glory to his name. I want to go ahead and read Exodus, the 14th chapter, verses 1 to 4. Exodus, the 14th chapter, verses 1 to 4. It's going to be right there on your screen. Then the Lord gave these instructions. And notice the words that I have in bold. Then the Lord gave these instructions to Moses. Order the Israelites to turn back and camp at Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. Camp there along the shore across from Baal-zephon. Then Pharaoh will think, notice what I have in bold, that the Israelites are confused. They are trapped in the wilderness. And once again, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after you. I have planned this. Look at this now. Listen. I have planned this in order to display my glory through Pharaoh and his whole army. After this, listen to what I'm saying now. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. So the Israelites camped there as they were told. In other words, they were obedient to what God said. And notice the things that I said, that I put in bold there. Notice he said, then Pharaoh will think the Israelites are confused. They're trapped in the wilderness. And once again, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Notice what he says there. I have planned this. Devil had nothing to do with this. Devil's not even involved with this. This is all me. This is what God is saying. In order to display my glory through Pharaoh and his whole army. After this, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Reason enough. Now, the Bible says that Pharaoh's heart was already hardened, even before God hardened it even further to fulfill his plan. Pharaoh's heart was already hardened. And we're going to look at that in Exodus, the 8th chapter. It's going to be right there on your screen. 8th chapter, verses 13 to 15 and verses 18 to 19. And this is the New King James Version. Now listen, because his heart was already hardened. So this is not God doing something against Pharaoh's will. It was the fact that Pharaoh's heart was already hardened. And what God did was take it to the next level, but he had a purpose for that. So let's read that. Exodus 8th chapter, verse 13 to 15, right there on your screen. So the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And the frogs died out of the house, out of the courtyards, and out of the fields. They gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and did not heed them, as the Lord said. Verse number 18. So there was lice on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had said. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard. So this is just two examples of the fact that this is before God hardens his heart. That his heart was already hardened. And everything is, and you know this story when Moses comes and Moses says, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh just would not listen. And so all of the different plagues came as a result of the fact that his heart was already hardened. His heart was already hardened. And regardless to what took place, he would not budge. It was hardened for several reasons. And I don't think I have ever heard anybody really discuss why his heart was hardened to begin with. And I don't remember in all the years that I've been in ministry and I've listened to different teachings and different sermons, I don't think I've heard anybody talk about why was his heart hardened to begin with. Number one, I'm going to give you some of the reasons. For number one, Pharaoh felt like the gods of Egypt were equal to the gods of the Israelites, which was Yahweh. He felt like his gods were equal. So he felt like, I don't have to do what you say because my gods are no different from yours. And when Moses did certain things with his rod, and then Pharaoh's magicians did certain things, and it just appeared, as if they were on equal standing, but they never were. And then the people under Pharaoh considered him to be a god with ultimate power over Egypt. The people under him considered him to be a god with ultimate power over Egypt. So that's another reason. And then the plagues were a direct attack against the gods of Egypt. The plagues, God brought in the plagues as a direct attack against the gods of Egypt, which made his heart hard. And he would never ever consider submitting his God to the God of the Israelites, Yahweh. So those are several reasons why his heart was hardened. He would never consider when God said, let my people go. He would never consider doing that because, again, that would mean that his gods were lesser gods. Even when his people had to suffer, even when they had to suffer under the plagues, Pharaoh would never change his mind because his heart was so hardened. Now, when he did let the people go, he came to himself and realized that their economy depended on Israeli or the Israelites for slaves. The entire economy depended on slave labor for construction, for constructing the cities, for building the monuments, for maintaining the infrastructure of the nation. Everything depended on Israelite slaves. And he came to himself. And he said, what in the world are we doing? But God had a plan. And we've got to understand, even in our lives today, God has a plan. So even when it looks like, God, I don't understand, where are you? I can't trace you. I can't hear from you. I don't know what's going on. My life feels like it's out of control. You best believe God has a plan, and it is to prosper you and not to harm you. We've got to know that wherever we are, God has us there. God knows where we are, and God has a plan. And so God's plan was to deliver his people from bondage and to eliminate the enemy once and for all at the same time. That was God's plan, to deliver his people from bondage and to eliminate the enemy once and for all. That was the plan. So why did God harden Pharaoh's heart, which was already hardened, even more? Why did he do that? Let me give you some reasons why he did that. Number one, to show his sovereignty and power. God will have no other God before him. And the minute that Pharaoh thought his gods were equal to God, Yahweh, God said, no, I have to show you. And so by hardening Pharaoh's heart, God ensured that Pharaoh would pursue the Israelites and that it would appear as though the Israelites, again, were confused, that they were being backed in, that they had no way of escape, and that because of the Red Sea in front of them and because of Pharaoh and the army. And it was not just behind them, it was fanned out along the sides. So the Red Sea was in front of them. You know the story. And the Israelites, just recently having been released from being in bondage for 400 years, they were not fighting machines. They were clueless. And the army of Pharaoh was fanned out. Not just straight, but fanned out. Whenever they turned, wherever they turned, all they could see was an army of Egyptians coming after them. So number one, God wanted him to think that the Israelites had no place to go. So God would perform a miracle, and he performed the miracle by parting the Red Sea. We know this story, which would demonstrate his ultimate power. God said, I'm going to show you who's God. I'm going to show you who's God. And God knew that he was going to part the Red Sea. Moses didn't. The children of Israel didn't. Remember, they came out. They came out as slaves, with a slave mentality. They never knew how to fight. They never knew how to use instruments like that. But God said, this battle's not yours anyway. It's mine. And I got you. I just need you to be where you're supposed to be. And I just need you to follow me. And I just need you to obey me. Now, I need you to hear me. I'm saying this time. I need you to hear me. God is saying the same thing to us. When we don't understand, when it doesn't look like we're going to make it, when it doesn't look like God's coming through, you need to hear the voice of God and you need to obey. Even when you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, why he has you here, why he didn't put you there, why he blocked this, why he stopped that. There's always a reason. And if we have a track record with God's faithfulness, then what we have to do is say, God, I don't understand, but I've come too far with you. I've come through too much with you. You have been a covenant-keeping God. You have been a faithful God. You've been a way-making God. And I am not going to be double-minded, and I'm not going to lean into my understanding now. Do I have any witnesses? Put it in the chat space. I am going to obey God, regardless to what it looks like, regardless to what I feel, regardless to the opinions of others. Because the children of Israel, if you remember what I just read, it said that they obeyed him. They obeyed him. God wanted to work a miracle. And in working the miracle, it would show that he had ultimate power and authority over everything else, that he had sovereignty to both the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Israelites who really had just come to know him, who were just coming to have faith in him. Oh yeah, they saw how God moved and they were set free. But they didn't have a track record with God, and God needed them to begin to trust him. And God said, if I can open up the Red Sea, they're going to have to begin to trust me. They're going to have to know without a shadow of a doubt that I am Lord God Almighty, and beside me there is none other. So God had to get the Israelites ready to have faith in him, and God had to get the Egyptians seeing that he was God Almighty. So many times, even in our own lives, God has to allow certain things to happen so that we will see. Only God can do it. Nobody, you know that song, nobody else but Jesus, nobody else. And many times we have to see that nobody else, not your job, not your degrees, not your networking, not your ability to rob Peter to pay Paul, to work behind the scenes. It is God. From the beginning, though, as we said, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And despite the plagues, his heart was hardened. But God said, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to make it even harder. And he's going to be able to see. So when God hardened his heart, number two, it was part of the judgment. It was part of the judgment that God had against the Egyptians for having oppressed his people to begin with. It was part of the judgment that God had against the Egyptians for oppressing his people for 400 years. And it was also because Pharaoh had pride and defiance, which was his downfall. Pharaoh had pride and defiance, and that was his downfall. So those were two reasons. And then there was a third reason also, and that is that God wanted to display his glory. He wanted to display his glory. Yes, he wanted the Egyptians to see that he was God, and yes, he wanted the Israelites to see that he was their God, and there was nothing too hard for him. But he also wanted to display his glory. So remember what he said in verse number 4. I'm going to read it to you again. This is what he said in verse number 4. I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptian will know that I am Lord. I'm going to gain glory for myself. God is all about being glorified. Never forget that. And so when God opens doors for you, when God makes a way for you, when God blesses you, when God does anything, make sure you give him glory. Make sure you have a testimony that says nobody else but Jesus. Make sure you honor him, that you bless him, that you reverence him, that you don't make it luck, or you don't take it for granted, or you don't think that you just deserve this, or because you've been walking with the Lord a long time, this is just part of it. Oh, God will bless and add no sorrow, but you need to be able to give him glory for everything that he does. And then there was a fourth reason. He wanted to strengthen, as I said, the faith of the Israelites. He needed to strengthen their faith, because when they left Egypt, their faith had not been developed. So when he knew that when Pharaoh and the armies were drowned, that their ability to see God protect them, God deliver them, God make a way for them, that would seal the deal, and they would see that they were serving Yahweh, the true and living God. That God was fulfilling his promises to lead them not only out of bondage, but lead them to the promised land. That was important to God. So What really goes through your mind? Think about it. What really goes through your mind when you realize that God is allowing you to go through certain things? What really goes through your mind? Because it is not easy even when you know God. I know that, let me put it to you this way. I have settled it. There is never a doubt in my mind that God is not almighty, that he's not the great I am, that he's not the supernatural, that he is not all powerful, that he is not God all by himself. Never in my mind do I believe that he cannot do anything. He can do everything but fail. Now, what we have to settle is, God, will you do it for me? Where do I fit in? Never a thought in my mind that God is not on the throne. Help me in the midst of whatever I'm going through to see you high and lifted up, and to know that you are working it out behind the scenes for my good, behind the scenes. Because at the time, there are times when we become double-minded, and times where we start to doubt and wonder, and times where we feel like throwing in the towel. Because God even took responsibility. If you notice what he said there, he told the Israelites, he told them that they were going to look like they were in a trap. He took responsibility for the army coming after them. Notice what he says. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to go back and set up the camp. Set up your camp facing the north by the sea. Tell them to go back. Go backwards? When the army is coming after us, go backwards, set up camp. You don't want us to run. See, the natural inclination of any person would be run, take off. And sometimes when we just feel this, I got to do something. I got to do something. Things are happening. I got to do something. And so we try to make it happen, and we get out of the will of God. We try to do the things that we used to do before we got saved, before we started trusting in God, because we knew how to make certain things happen so that we would have a positive outcome. God doesn't want you to make it happen unless he's told you to make it happen, and then he's given you the instructions. What I love about the children of Israel is that they obeyed him. And when God said go back, now who would tell you to go back when they're behind you? Who would tell you to settle down for a moment? God had a plan. Now, I want to read to you something that C.H. Mackintosh stated, author C.H. Mackintosh. The sea was before them, Pharaoh's host behind them, and the mountains around them. And all this, be it observed, permitted, and ordered by God. Let me read that again. C.H. Mackintosh. The sea was before them, Pharaoh's host behind them, the mountains around them. And all this being observed, permitted, and ordered by God. All of this. So I need you to know this. I need you to know 4 different things. That God will do the same thing with each one of us. He will test our faith. He will lead us into hardship. He will teach us wisdom. And he will show us his ways. Let me say that again. He will test our faith. This was a test of their faith. He will lead them into hardship. He was the one leading them. This had nothing to do with the devil. We're so used to rebuking the devil, binding the devil, take authority over the devil, and you should do that more. But what happens when it's not the devil and it is God and in his plan? Remember, I told you God is in control. That's the name of the series. And he knows where you are. He has you where you are. That's part 1. We need to understand at certain times God is doing certain things, and he has a reason for everything he does. So I want to look at several biblical leaders for just a moment before we close. I want to look at several biblical leaders because it's one thing for me to say it. I want to show it to you in the Word of God. And then if we were to, I do so much reading, and I read the testimonies of people who have had to deal with catastrophic circumstances, crisis, the loss of this, the death of this, the losing of this, the different testimonies of people, cancer, and just you name it. And God got the glory. And God brought them through. And at the time it was difficult and it didn't seem fair. And that's the thing about the story. You've got to understand that you have a comma, not a period. You've got to understand that there is more to your story than where you are now. You've got to understand that there's a rest of your story. And don't make permanent decisions based upon temporary circumstances. Do you hear me? So let's look about 2 or 3 different examples of what I'm talking about. We're going to be looking at Genesis, the 21st chapter, verse number 17 to 18. Remember, God is in control. That's the name of this series. God knows where you are. God has you where you are. That's part 1. Genesis 21st chapter, verse 17 to 18, right there on your screen. But God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. God has heard the boy crying. As he lies there, go to him and comfort him. Now notice what God says. For I will make a great nation from his descendants. This is talking about Ishmael. Look up for a moment. And we know the story of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And when God promised Abraham and Abram and Sarai, and then Abraham and Sarah, their names were changed, that they would be the father of a multitude, the mother of a multitude. At an old age, they had no children, and they decided to help God out. And Abraham took Hagar to have a child with in order to fulfill the purposes of God. God didn't ask him for that, and Ishmael was not the child of promise. And so what happened was Hagar was put out. Sarah told Abraham to put bondwoman, because she was a slave, and her son out. And when he did that, and they ran out of food, they were in the wilderness, and she put him under a tree, and she went further and began to cry out to God. And she said, I just can't stand to see my son die. Go back and look at chapter number 21. Go back and look at chapter number 21 of Genesis. And God heard it, because God had a plan. And God says, don't worry about that. I'm going to make him a great nation. And we know that ultimately he became a great nation. And we know that today, one of the things we're fighting over is the land of Isaac and the land of Ishmael. And so he made him a great nation. But they had to go through. God knew where they were. God allowed Hagar to be put out in the wilderness. God knew. Hagar did not ask to become the mother of Abraham's son. She was a slave. She didn't ask to become the mother. And yet God knew where she was. God had her there, and God worked on her behalf. That's number one. The second example I want to share with you, you may not be as familiar with, and it is coming from 2 Kings, the 18th chapter, verses 5 to 7 and verse number 13. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on this one, just in case you're familiar with Hezekiah, but you may not be familiar with this particular story, because there's more written about Hezekiah in the book of Kings and in Chronicles. But this is right there on your screen, and we're talking about Hezekiah, who brought revival to the nation. He was a good king. He was trapped by one of the most powerful armies of that time, and the army was determined to annihilate him. He was a wonderful king, and he brought a revival. He tore down the idols. He brought back the word of God into the temple, and so he was doing all the right things. And when you're doing all the right things, that's when you wonder, God, why? I'm not suffering because of sin. I'm not suffering because I've done anything wrong. Why are you allowing this? So let's read this. Because for some of us, we are not going through because there was something that we're paying for in terms of a sin that out of rebellion and disobedience. God has us where we are because there's something he wants to do in us, through us, and with us. In us, through us, and with us. Remember that. So let's read 2 Kings, the 18th chapter. This might help you as you are trying to navigate and come to an understanding as to why am I going through? Why did this happen in my life? Why did this happen in my marriage? Why did this happen with my children? Why did this happen with my spouse? Why is it happening with my finances, my health? Let's read this. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. Notice it says he trusted. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah. That lets you know he was a man of God, either before or after his time. He remained faithful to the Lord in everything He remained faithful to the Lord in everything. I'm saying this so that you would get a picture of a man that why is he going through? And he was careful to obey all the commands the Lord had given Moses. So the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. And Hezekiah was successful in everything he did. Verse number 13. In the 14th year of Hezekiah, King Hezekiah's reign, King Sennacherib of Assyria came to attack the fortified towns of Judah and conquer them. The Assyrians were a powerful army. And again, they were one of the most powerful armies at that time. So now we're going to continue to look at 2 Kings, the 19th chapter, verses 14 and 16. It's going to be right there on your screen. But what I do want you to remember, everything we've just read is how great King Hezekiah was. What God allowed, and there was an army that was coming to annihilate them, to attack them, to wipe them out, to conquer them. God knew it, and God was allowing it for a reason. But I want you to see what happens. 2 Kings, right there, 19th chapter, verses 14 and 16. After Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, so much happens in between. So go back and read the 18th chapter, 19th chapter, 20th chapter of 2 Kings. Go back and read it, okay? Because you'll get the whole breadth of the story. There's so much in that story. And I need for you to see everything that went on. Because the Assyrians were some bold soldiers, a bold army, a bold king. So let's read it. After Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it, he went up to the Lord's temple. I need you to look at this because this tells you what you have to do sometimes when you're under attack. Look at what it says here. He went up to the Lord's temple and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed this prayer before the Lord. O Lord, God of Israel, you are enthroned between the mighty cherubs. You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone created the heavens and the earth. Bend down, O Lord, and listen. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. Listen to Sennacherib's words of defiance against the living God. Stop for a moment. We're going to look at some more scripture in just a moment, but let's unpack this for a moment. He got the letter. And if you go back, you're going to see that the king kept sending letters back and forth to intimidate Hezekiah, to convince Hezekiah that his God wasn't going to come through, to convince Hezekiah, because it's true, he had the most powerful army of that time. It was true. And some things are true. You get an evil report, and we're not going to deny that the report is there, but we know who God is. And sometimes the reality is, instead of going, I rebuke you, I don't believe in you, acknowledge what it is and say, but God. But God. He is the lifter. He is the healer. He is the God of a breakthrough. He is the deliverer. He is who goes before me to make every crooked path straight. He said that if one could put 1,000 to flight, two can put 10,000. He is God Almighty. That's what you have to believe in. But the reality was this army, the Assyrian army, was a great army. But notice what he did. He went to the house of God. Many of us, when we're going through, we have meltdowns. We can talk the problem, but we don't take them to God. We can go over them. We can go to sleep with it. We can try to use different things to mask our stress level and to help us to cope with it. Drugs won't do it. Alcohol won't do it. Getting high won't do it. Relationships won't do it. There are some things that only God will be able to do. And he understood that. So he went to the temple. He laid the letter out and he began to remind God of who he was. And really, God doesn't need to be reminded of who he is, but what it does, it reminds you of who he is. And so he reminds God. And he praises God, and he worships God, and he honors God, and he exalts God, and he gets God's attention. He gets God's attention. We just came out of a series, and in the series that we just came out of, the manifested presence of God, when we understand thanksgiving, praise, and worship, when we understand that we want to create an atmosphere so that God's presence will be in our midst, so that we get his attention. Well, I can tell you Hezekiah got his attention because he said all the right things. You are God and God alone. No one can compare to you. And when you start thinking about how great your God is, it will minimize, it will help put in perspective the things you're going through. And that is what happens. So now let's look at what God says in 2 Kings, the 19th chapter, verses 35 to 37. 2 Kings, the 19th chapter, verses 35 to 37, right there on your screen. And then we're going to look at chapter number 19, verses, again, 35 to 37. That night, the angel of the Lord went out to the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Do I need to repeat that? That night, the angel of the Lord, you need to understand the angel of the Lord, went out to the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. When the surviving Assyrians woke up the next morning, they found corpses everywhere. Then King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and returned to his own land. He went home to his capital of Nineveh and stayed there. Now listen to this. Verse number, again, we're going to continue. One day, while he was worshiping in the temple of his god, Nishrosh, his sons, Adramelech and Shazar, killed him with their swords. They then escaped to the land of Anarat, and another son, Esarhaddon, became the next king of Assyria. Look up. So what happened? God said, the battle was never yours to begin with. It was mine. I needed you to do exactly what you did. I needed you to know who was going to deliver you. I needed you to come to me. I needed you to call upon me. I needed you to put your trust in me. I have led you so far. You have always had a track record with me. I wasn't going to let you down, but I did let you go through. I did let you be put in a position where you knew that you couldn't do it on your own, and I had a plan already in place. And God said this was sweatless victory because I fought the battle for you. And what I need you to know today is God is fighting your battles. God has a plan for you. God has a plan to bring you up and bring you out and bring you over. God has a plan to heal and deliver, set free, to meet your needs. You cannot allow what you're going through, what it looks like, how you feel, how long it's been, to cause you to waver in your trust in God, your reliance in God, your ability to still know that he is the great I am. The devil wants you to begin to question the power of God, question your confidence in God, to become double-minded as to whether God is able. God is in control. When they came out, 185,000 of them were dead. And the rest of them said, you know what, it's time to break camp. And so they ran back to their city, to their town. But in the process, the king, who was worshiping his God at his temple, was killed by his own sons. I need you to understand. Now, why did Hezekiah have to go through? After all, he was doing everything right? I don't know. But God had a purpose. And he wanted to come after the Assyrian army, because they were a ruthless army. They were an army that would kill, an army that would rape the women, an army that would burn children, an army that killed the men. They were a ruthless army. I want to give you a final one. Because the Bible lets us know that God does allow our faith to be tried. He allows it to be tried, and he permits trouble to come into our lives. And it is not because he wants to see you cry and see me cry and see me go through. It is he doesn't want to destroy us. He wants to mature us, and he wants to transform us, and he wants to prepare us for the next level of our purpose and destiny. He doesn't want to destroy us. I need you to know that. He wants to mature us, and he wants to prepare us for the next level of our destiny. We will never get to where we need to be if we are always trying to avoid challenges, avoid problems. And God is a God who knows exactly where you are, and he's going to deliver you. So I want to conclude this with a story that you're somewhat familiar with, and it's the story with Paul as a prisoner, destined to stand trial before Caesar. Paul is a prisoner. He was destined to stand trial before Caesar, and that's the key. He was destined to stand trial. Destined to stand trial. So now let's read this coming from Acts the 27th chapter, verses 21 to 26. Acts the 27th chapter, verses 21 to 26. Because remember, the key is he is destined to stand trial. He is a prisoner, but he's destined. And when you know that God has promised you something, whatever happens in between, you don't allow yourself to zero in on that. When God says, this is what I have for you, that is what you've got to take to the bank. Let's read this, and we're going to conclude. No one had eaten for a long time. It's right there on your screen. Finally, Paul called the crew together and said, men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all the damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. Listen to what he said. Even though the ship's going to go down, even though it's going to look like we're all going to die, even though it's going to look like we are never going to make it. Notice what he says. None of you are going to lose your life. But take courage. None of you will lose your life, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel, go back to those angels. God has angels encamped about us. Last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me, and he said, do not be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe in God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. Look out. But we will be. I have preached this and before. I have preached this. And what Paul did while they were on that ship, before it broke up and they had to swim and they had to get to the shore. But God knew where he was. God allowed them to be shipwrecked. Why, God? You could have taken them safely to Rome so that he could stand before Caesar. Why did he have to go through the storm? Why did he have to get shipwrecked? Why did he have to end up on an island of Malta? Why? Now go back and look at this story, chapter number 27, and go back and look at it. But all of this happened. God knew where he was. God had a purpose for everything he did. Yet, Paul said, I have a destiny to fulfill. And I can't die before I do it. And what you need to be able to say is, God has made me a promise, and I cannot die before it's fulfilled. God has told me certain things, and I'm going to hide them in my heart regardless of what it looks like. So as we conclude this lesson, I want to remind you of one thing. And I want you to write this thing down. Somebody put it in the chat space. I want you to remember that you're here. You're here by God's appointment, in his keeping, under his training, and for his time. You're here by God's appointment, in his keeping, under his training, for his time. I'm going to say it the third time. Put it in the chat space. You are here right where you are today. By God's appointment, in his keeping, under his training, for his time. And the same God that has led you in will lead you out. Join me next week for part 2. God is in control. You are here by God's appointment, in his keeping, under his training, for his time. Let that sink in and realize God is in control. He knows where you are. God bless until next week. Can I get you to share this word? Can I get you to share this word? Until next week, God bless.